3 in the morning, not a sound in the house, everyone else is asleep. And you are lying completely still, trying not to move because moving means feeling it. The dull, grinding ache in your knees or your hands or your hips. The specific location changes depending on the night. The waking up does not. You have learned to manage it. You shift positions slowly. You wait for the worst of it to pass. Sometimes it does. Sometimes you are still lying there an hour later, running through the ceiling tiles in your head. And the morning is its own thing entirely. That first step out of bed. The hands that do not want to close around the faucet handle for the first few minutes. The hips that need walking before they agree to work properly. That stiffness that gradually loosens over 30 minutes or an hour until you almost feel like yourself again. Most people call this arthritis. Most people call it aging. Both of those things may be true, but neither of them explains what is actually driving the pain. And more specifically, neither of them explains why the pain is consistently worse at night and in the early morning, rather than evenly distributed across the day. Because if joint pain were simply about structural damage, cartilage wear, bone changes, the accumulated mileage of a lifetime, it would be constant. It would not have a schedule. It has a schedule because it is driven, in significant part, by something that does have a schedule. Something that rises and falls across the 24-hour cycle in ways that are now very well understood in the rheumatology literature. And that largely explains the specific pattern of nighttime and morning pain that most people with joint problems experience. That something is inflammation, not the inflammation you feel when you cut your finger, the acute, localized, visible swelling that represents your immune system responding to tissue damage or infection. That kind of inflammation is protective, proportionate, and temporary. What drives joint pain in older adults is something different. Chronic low-grade inflammatory signaling that persists not because there is an ongoing threat requiring immune response, but because the regulatory mechanisms that are supposed to resolve inflammation and return tissue to a resting state are not functioning efficiently enough to do so. Chronic joint inflammation follows a circadian rhythm. The cytokines, the molecular messengers that orchestrate and sustain the inflammatory response within joint tissue, are regulated by the same circadian clock that governs sleep, hormone production, and dozens of other biological processes. Specifically, interleukin-6 and tumor necrosis factor alpha, two of the primary pro-inflammatory cytokines found in elevated concentrations in arthritic joint tissue, are produced in higher quantities during the overnight period, peaking in the early morning hours between 2 and 6 a.m. This is not random. It is the biological explanation for morning stiffness, for why the alarm goes off and the joints feel worse than they did when you got into bed. The inflammatory machinery of joint tissue has been running at elevated activity through the night, and the structural consequences of that, swelling, fluid accumulation, chemical irritation of the pain receptors within the joint capsule, are at their maximum when morning arrives. Cortisol counteracts this process. Your body's own cortisol, produced by the adrenal glands, is a potent endogenous anti-inflammatory hormone, and its production is highest in the early morning hours precisely because it has evolved to suppress the overnight inflammatory surge and prepare the body for waking activity. This is why many people with inflammatory joint conditions find that the stiffness improves after an hour or so of being awake. The cortisol has risen, the inflammatory tide has turned, and the joints gradually loosen. But in older adults, the cortisol response becomes less robust. The amplitude of the cortisol rhythm, the difference between its lowest nighttime levels and its morning peak, decreases with age. The inflammatory suppression is less complete. The overnight inflammatory activity in joint tissue runs longer and higher than it did at 40. And the morning experience reflects that. This is the mechanism that determines what will and will not help. Interventions that address inflammation, specifically interventions that act on the circadian pattern of joint inflammation and that deliver their biological activity during the overnight window when that inflammation is most active, have a rational basis for producing the effect described in today's title. Something consumed in the evening, present in the tissues during the overnight inflammatory surge, working against the molecular machinery of that surge. That something is tart cherry, specifically concentrated tart cherry, Montmorency tart cherry, the sour variety cultivated primarily in Michigan and parts of Europe. Available as concentrated juice, as powder, or as extract, which can be dissolved in warm herbal tea as the last drink of the evening. I want to walk through the evidence carefully because the mechanism here is specific and the research is more robust than most people expect from a fruit. Tart cherries contain extraordinarily high concentrations of a class of plant compounds called anthocyanins, the same family of pigment molecules that give blueberries, red cabbage, and beets their deep colors. But the specific anthocyanin profile of Montmorency tart cherries, dominated by cyanidin-3 glucosyl rutinoside and cyanidin-3 rutinoside, has a documented biological activity that is directly relevant to the inflammatory machinery I described. If those names sound familiar, it is because they are the same enzymes targeted by the entire class of nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drugs: ibuprofen, naproxen, aspirin. NSAIDs work by blocking COX enzyme activity, which reduces the production of prostaglandins, the local inflammatory signaling molecules that sensitize pain receptors in joint tissue. The difference, and it matters enormously, is the mechanism of delivery and the associated risk profile. NSAIDs, as I have discussed in previous conversations, carry real risks for kidney function, gastrointestinal integrity, and cardiovascular health in older adults. A 2012 study published in the Osteoarthritis and Cartilage Journal, one of the leading rheumatology research publications, enrolled 58 women aged 40 to 70 with radiographically confirmed osteoarthritis of the knee and randomized them to consume tart cherry juice twice daily or a control drink for 6 weeks. The tart cherry group showed significantly reduced levels of C-reactive protein, a primary systemic marker of inflammatory activity, compared to control. The reduction was clinically meaningful and was accompanied by self-reported improvements in pain and function. The researchers identified the QX inhibiting activity of the anthocyanin profile as the primary mechanistic explanation for the findings. A 2013 randomized crossover trial published in the Journal of Functional Foods examined the effect of tart cherry consumption, specifically on serum uric acid levels. Uric acid is the metabolic byproduct whose crystallization in joint tissue causes gout, one of the most acutely painful forms of joint inflammation. The melatonin content of Montmorency tart cherry concentrate is modest, not equivalent to a pharmacological melatonin supplement, but biologically meaningful when consumed in the evening. A 2011 study published in the European Journal of Nutrition, conducted by researchers at Northumbria University, examined the effect of tart cherry juice consumed morning and evening on sleep quality and melatonin levels in adults. Simultaneously, the glymphatic clearance system operates at its maximum capacity during deep sleep, clearing metabolic waste from neural and peripheral tissue. The tart cherry is, in other words, addressing the nighttime joint pain problem through two converging pathways simultaneously. Direct COX inhibiting anti-inflammatory activity from the anthocyanins, present in the joint tissue during the overnight inflammatory surge, and melatonin-mediated improvement in sleep architecture, which enhances the body's own overnight anti-inflammatory regulatory mechanisms. Better sleep produces lower overnight inflammatory cytokine levels, which means lower morning pain and stiffness. Lower overnight inflammatory activity means less pain-related awakening, which means better sleep maintenance. The cycle that has been working against you, fragmented sleep from pain, more inflammation from fragmented sleep, more pain, can begin to reverse. A 2018 pilot randomized controlled trial published in the Journal of Functional Foods specifically examined this interaction, looking at both inflammatory markers and sleep quality simultaneously in older adults with inflammatory arthritis consuming tart cherry concentrate versus placebo. The cherry group showed improvements in both domains, with the greatest improvements in individuals who had both the highest baseline inflammatory markers and the most disrupted sleep at the start of the study. Again, the greatest benefit where the need is greatest. How to use this correctly. 1 to 2 tablespoons of Montmorency tart cherry concentrate, dissolved in warm herbal tea, consumed 30 to 60 minutes before bed. The timing is deliberate. The anthocyanins need approximately 60 to 90 minutes to reach peak plasma concentration after consumption. Taking the cherry concentrate an hour before sleep means peak anthocyanin levels in the circulation coincide with the early part of the overnight inflammatory window, the period when interleukin-6 and TNF-alpha are beginning their nighttime rise in joint tissue. The melatonin component of the cherry acts on a similar timeline, beginning to signal the circadian clock toward sleep initiation in a window that aligns with the natural melatonin rise the body should be producing as darkness deepens. The herbal tea vehicle is not incidental. Several herbal teas serve as meaningful complementary bases for this habit. Chamomile tea contains apigenin, a flavonoid that binds to the same benzodiazepine receptors in the brain that sedative medications target, producing mild anxiolytic and sleep-promoting effects without pharmacological potency or dependency risk. Combined with the melatonin from tart cherry, chamomile tea as the base drink creates a mild, natural pre-sleep environment that supports the transitions into deep sleep that the whole strategy depends on. Ginger tea as the base adds a second layer of anti-inflammatory activity through a distinct mechanism. Ginger's active compounds, primarily gingerols and shogals, inhibit the production of inflammatory prostaglandins and leukotrienes through pathways that partially overlap with but are distinct from the COX inhibition of the cherry anthocyanins. The The combination of QX inhibition from cherry and leukotriene pathway modulation from ginger represents a broader spectrum of coverage of the inflammatory cascade driving joint pain. Rosehip tea deserves specific mention as a base for anyone with osteoarthritic joint pain specifically. Rosehip, the fruit of the rose plant, contains a galactolipid compound called GOPO that has been studied in multiple randomized controlled trials for osteoarthritis specifically, with findings suggesting meaningful reductions in joint pain and stiffness scores compared to placebo. A 2008 meta-analysis in osteoarthritis and cartilage found that rosehip powder reduced pain scores in osteoarthritis patients significantly across multiple trials. Rosehip tea, as the base for the evening tart cherry drink, combines two separately evidence-supported compounds in a single pre-sleep ritual. Any of these work. The specific choice depends on taste preference and what is practically accessible. The consistent elements are the tart cherry concentrate and the timing. The concentrate matters because the dose is what the evidence supports. Whole tart cherries contain the relevant compounds, but to reach the doses used in the positive clinical trials through whole cherries alone, you would need to consume approximately 60 cherries per evening. Impractical. The quality of the product matters. Look for Montmorency variety specifically. It is the cultivar studied in the clinical research, and the anthocyanin profile of Montmorency is meaningfully different from sweet cherries or other tart cherry varieties. The realistic timeline. This is important. The first night, nothing dramatic happens. After 7 to 10 days of consistent evening use, some people begin to notice that the 3 a.m. waking is less frequent. After 3 to 4 weeks, the inflammatory marker changes documented in the clinical trials are accumulating in the background. CRP is lower. Uric acid may have shifted. The COX activity in synovial tissue has been consistently modulated every night. The morning stiffness period, the window between first movement and functional comfort, begins to shorten. 10 minutes shorter, then 20. Then the first morning you get out of bed and your knee does not immediately remind you that it is there. 6 to 8 weeks of consistent evening consumption is the minimum to expect the full effect documented in the controlled trials. Most of the positive trials ran for 6 weeks. The effect at 6 weeks is larger than at 2 weeks. This is a habit with a timeline, not an intervention with an immediate outcome. If you are taking allopurinol for gout management, the uric acid lowering effect of tart cherry may be additive to your medication, which is generally favorable. Monitoring blood sugar response and discussing the addition with your physician or dietitian is appropriate. The mild platelet aggregation inhibiting properties of anthocyanins at high doses warrant a conversation with your physician before beginning. For the majority of adults over 65 without these specific situations, 1 to 2 tablespoons of Montmorency tart cherry concentrate in a warm herbal tea consumed 30 to 60 minutes before bed is safe, evidence supported, and addresses the specific biology of nighttime and morning joint pain through 2 distinct and complementary mechanisms. The joint pain you wake up with has a cause. The cause is biological, circadian, and modifiable. You are not sentenced to 3 a.m. awakenings because you are older. You are experiencing the consequence of an inflammatory process that runs at night in joint tissue in a pattern that was always going to be hardest at night and worst in the morning, unless something is present in your system during those hours that works against it. Something inexpensive, something you dissolve in a cup of warm tea, something you take with you into the dark when you go to bed. That is the habit. That is what the evidence supports. If this changed how you understand the pattern of your own joint pain, the timing, the mechanism, the specific reason it is worse in the morning rather than the afternoon, hit the like button right now. That one action tells this platform that honest, specific health information for older adults deserves to reach more people who are lying awake at 3 in the morning wondering what is happening to their body. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell. Every week there is one video here built on the same principle: mechanism first, evidence second, practical action third, because information without the reasoning behind it does not stick, and information that sticks is the only kind that changes anything. Leave me a comment with this. At what time of night is your joint pain typically at its worst, and which joints are most affected? That specific pattern has a specific biological explanation, and the answer tells me more about what your inflammatory system is doing than almost any other single piece of information you could share. Write it below. I read every comment and I respond when I can.